welcome. So good to see lots of familiar faces. I know some of you were here last year and we've got some new folks joining as well for this event, which is great. My name is Sarah and I'm the local extension educator here in Cook County. My office is in the community center, just a couple blocks up the street here. And my role is to be a connector and a resource between Cook County and University of Minnesota resources on lots of different topics, including Spruce Budworm. So I encourage you to reach out and contact me about anything that you think we might be able to bring to Cook County from University of Minnesota resources. And I'll also have Anna introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Stockstad. I'm an extension forester with UMN Extension. My office is down in Cloquet. I live in Duluth, but I work all across northern Minnesota doing education related to forest stewardship, as well as climate adaptation and forest ecosystem health. I'm always really grateful to be able to come up here to speak to you all. I love making the drive up from Duluth up to Grand Marais, so I'm really happy to be here on such a beautiful day with you all. I guess we go ahead and get started then. All right. There we go. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through what the plan is for today. So Sarah and I are going to give a roughly 30-minute presentation that's going to give you an overview of spruce budworm biology, identification, and management. And then we're going to hear from Kyle Stover from the Kelly Beaster from the North Shore Forest Collaborative to hear about the resources and programs that are available to you as woodland stewards. Then at the end, we'll have time for discussion and questions that you may have. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass over to Sarah. I'm going to start the timer. Perfect. There you go.
Sarah. Okay, so we're going to get started just talking about some of the basics of what is spruce budworm, so we're all kind of on the same page. So the organism that we're talking about today, the name spruce budworm is used for both the adult moth and the caterpillar of the same insect. So it has multiple parts of its life cycle, and you might see more than one of those parts over the course of this year. The caterpillar is what feeds on the trees, and its host species are mainly balsam fir and white spruce, but it will also eat other conifer species. Last summer, I observed it feeding on tamarack, red pine, white pine. So when its population is really high, it'll go for some of those other species as well, but it does prefer balsam fir mainly and white spruce as well. As I mentioned, it's a native caterpillar and moth, so it's native to our area. This is not an invasive species that we're trying to eradicate. It gets fairly easy to identify once you start seeing it out in the woods and probably in your yard as well. The places to look first are on balsam fir and white spruce. And the caterpillar itself is about 1/2 inch long. And I find it easiest to look on the ends of the branches. You'll see these sort of messy, looks kind of like a spider web all twisted together at the tips of the branches. And that's this silk-like web that the caterpillar pulls those needles around itself to kind of hide out while it's feeding on those tasty new needles at the ends of the branches, and it protects itself from predators by doing that. So look for those kind of spiderweb like things on the tips of the branches. And then later on in the summer too, you can also look for that kind of rusty tipped color on the tops of trees or out towards the edges of trees. Driving along the highway, especially 61 as you go down towards Lake County, you'll see, if you look on hillsides of balsam fir and spruce, this sort of reddish tinge to the woods. So like I said, once you start to notice it, you're probably going to see it everywhere. I remember a few years ago when it was first moving this direction from Lake County, starting to recognize it and then being out on hikes and just, oh, there it is. Oh, it's on that tree too. Oh, there it is. So you'll see it in lots of places. Later on, after the caterpillars have turned into the moths, you'll also find the casings left behind on trees, which I think look kind of like a little tiny ice cream cone that's brown. It's like a shell that they leave behind when they transform into the moths. And as far as host species, we've already mentioned the top two are balsam fir and white spruce. And balsam fir is highly susceptible to mortality from heavy feeding by spruce budworm. It can die in 3 to 4 years, and white spruce lasts a little bit longer. It has moderate survival rate under a heavy infestation like we're experiencing right now, but it can also be killed by this heavy feeding from spruce budworm. One thing that we're going to emphasize throughout the presentation is that diversity in your forest or in your yard or in your woods is the key to having less impact from an outbreak like this. Diversity means the number of kinds of trees that you have, ages of trees, and their health. So in a forest that has low susceptibility to impact, it has really healthy, vigorous trees. There are more trees that are not the host species of spruce budworm. So instead of just having balsam fir in your yard, you might have some other trees planted, some other species as well. Forest stands and yards that are really susceptible to having a really high impact from this outbreak are ones that are densely packed, mainly balsam fir. You can probably picture those skinny balsam that you see around here a lot. And those stands are more likely to be heavily impacted by the spruce budworm outbreak that we're in right now. Which, let's talk a little bit about where it's happening. So these maps come from the Minnesota DNR Forest Health Report, which is a really fun read if you want to look it up. They've got great visualizations of the outbreak. This one here shows different times, late 90s to early 2000s. And then you can see as we get closer to today, this dotted line shows 2021 to 2023 right here in Cook County and the far northeast Arrowhead. And the map on the other side shows in 2023 the impacts on the forests here in our area, and the darker colors show more tree mortality from this current budworm outbreak versus the lighter colors. But as you can see, it's made its way kind of from Lake County and now fully into Cook County, and we're seeing a lot of impact. Last summer especially, we saw a really high impact from spruce budworm. And the last thing I want to note in this sort of basic discussion is that often we can get into sort of a black and white thinking about budworm, bad, good, you know, is it good for the tree, bad for the tree, my yard, my woods, but it's a much more complicated story than that when you start to zoom out a little bit. This super complex diagram is from a scientific paper where scientists were studying the food web related to a balsam fir tree. So all of those different lines and numbers indicate different species that are connected to the food web of a single species of tree, which in our discussion today, I think a takeaway from that is that so from your perspective, budworm might be a bad thing because it's killing a tree in your yard. But for a migratory bird, it might be a great snack that they found that wasn't there a few years ago. Budworm is a prey species for a lot of different other insects and other small mammals. And it's also connected to, its rise and fall is connected to a lot of really complicated factors, including climate and weather, including, you know, the rise and fall of these predator-prey relationships too.
All right, now I'm going to give an update on where we're at right now in the current outbreak of spruce budworm. So unfortunately, I'm not here with super great news. The total numbers of acres impacted has increased as of last year in 2023. This data is from the 2023 DNR Forest Health Report. And so last year there were 64,800 acres impacted. So that includes defoliation and mortality from spruce budworm. And this is actually the highest number of acres impacted since 1961. And so this means that on average, there's 417,000 acres impacted since 2019. And so this average has been going up. And now I want to look at this chart, which is showing the trends in spruce budworm impacts across time, and just look at a few peaks here on this chart. So when we look at 2006, we can see a pretty large peak in the number of acres impacted for that time. And what happened in 2006 was there was a flash drought. And a flash drought is when we have a severe or extreme drought that's happening on top of a very hot growing season. So it's pretty much a very intense drought occurring during an already really, really hot growing season. And then when we look forward to 2021, we can see that this is when we had the 2021 drought and the Greenwood fire. And the reason that I'm highlighting these two peaks here is to show that relationship between drought and spruce budworm impacts. And I'm going to talk more about this later on, but both drought and spruce budworm is a stressor to trees. And trees, depending on, if it's balsam fir or spruce, they can fight off drought. They might be able to withstand the impacts of spruce budworm for a few years. But when we start to compound those stressors, so drought on top of spruce budworm, that can be too much for that tree to handle, and that can lead to wider spread mortality. So it's just like us as humans, when we have a lot of stressors going on at one time, that can impact our immune system. It's the same for trees when we start to stack those stressors on top of each other. So now I give you an update on where we're at currently in the outbreak. I'm going to walk you through the life cycle of spruce budworm. And we're going to start in July and August when we have the adult moths flying. They're pretty nondescript brown moths, about 1 inch in size. But what makes these adult moths special is that they can fly really long distances. They've actually been identified flying up to 125 miles in one night in Canada, so they can really cover a lot of ground. And these adult moths can lay eggs at multiple sites as they're flying, but they only typically lay one generation of eggs per year. So those adult moths are flying, and they're laying egg masses at the tips of needles in July and August. And so, like I said, they lay one generation of eggs per year, but they can lay up to 10 egg masses. And on average, there's 20 eggs per egg mass. So that adds up to a lot of potential eggs that the adult moths could be laying. And of course, these egg masses are susceptible to predation from other organisms, whether those are insects or maybe small mammals that are looking for a snack and they're going to eat those egg masses. But typically, if those egg masses aren't predated on by other organisms, they hatch in between 8 to 12 days. So those eggs hatch and then they develop into larvae, and then they're going to overwinter in the hibernaculum between August and May. And so that hibernaculum is what Sarah was talking about earlier, where it's kind of this webby structure at the ends of the branches. So those larvae will overwinter in the hibernaculum between August and May. And then they'll emerge from the hibernaculum and feed on the buds at the ends of the branches. So those buds that are required for new growth on the tree. And so those larvae, again, are susceptible to predation from other organisms, birds, other insects, including things like parasitoid wasps. So things that parasitize the larvae, which is a really interesting dynamic, which would be fun to talk more about, but we don't have time today. But there are other factors that can control the populations of larvae. So that includes not only predation, but also harsher winters can lead to population decline because they can't complete their full life cycle. And then for those of you that listened to a recent WTIP interview on spruce budworm, there was also a really interesting fact in there that warmer winters may also decrease survival of the larvae. Because when larvae go into the hibernaculum, they store up on carbon stores, so pretty much food for themselves to make it through the winter. But when those winter temperatures warm up, that's going to speed up their metabolism and cause them to go through those food supplies quicker, leading to starvation and then mortality in those larvae. So that's an interesting dynamic there, where warmer winters could actually decrease populations of spruce budworm. And then in the summer, larvae do prefer hot, dry summers. So all of these just kind of key into what are the climate change implications on spruce budworm populations. And as we know, it's pretty complex when we think about it. So those larvae are eating away at the ends of the branches on those buds, and then they're going to pupate. And that pupal stage lasts about 10 days in June and July. And then they are in that pupal stage for 10 days, and then they emerge as those adult moths, and the cycle begins again. And then we start seeing that reddened foliage, those burnt tips in July from the feeding on those buds at the ends of the branches. Okay, so now we've walked you through the biology and just the basics of spruce budworm, and now we're going to talk about the why. Why is it important to care about how spruce budworm impacts our trees and forests? And all of you already care, I'm sure, because you're here today, but we're just going to walk you through some of this. So I'm going to start first on the tree level and then expand to the forest level. So the spruce budworm eats the buds of the tree each year that are required for new growth. So this means that each year the budworm is preventing that new growth. And so trees have a priority list of what they put their energy towards. That could be growing taller, putting on horizontal growth, growing wider, putting on structures such as cones. But when they're trying to fight off an outbreak from spruce budworm, they're putting a lot of energy just towards trying to maintain their new growth and fight off that spruce budworm. And when a tree isn't growing, it's not going to be thriving. So that means that that tree, when it's under the impact of spruce budworm, is under constant stress. And so it's not able to put energy towards growing and other really important processes that it needs in order to be a healthy and vigorous tree. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this becomes a real issue when that stress from spruce budworm compounds with other stressors, such as from drought, or maybe we have a crazy winter with lots of freeze-thaw cycles that can also stress out the trees. So when those stressors start stacking up, that we see wider spread, more severe impacts from spruce budworm. And so across the landscape, as we all know, this leads to widespread losses in balsam fir and white spruce in our forests. So then as we expand and think more broadly on the forest scale, so we have a lot more dead balsam fir on the landscape due to spruce budworm. And dead balsam fir is a perfect ladder fuel. And what I say, so a ladder fuel, when I say that, it just means a tree that can, a dead tree especially, that can carry the fire from the forest floor up into the canopy of the forest, acting like a ladder. And the reason why we have so much balsam fir on the landscape in general is due to fire suppression. We live in a fire-dependent landscape, and due to fire suppression, we have a buildup of balsam fir, which would typically be burnt off during fires. And of course, we want to be avoiding large-scale fires that can threaten our communities and our ecosystems, but fire is a natural part of our landscape. And then when we're losing a lot of balsam fir and spruce in our forests, we're also losing resilience, because a lot of our forests have a major component of spruce and fir. And so when those trees are dying off due to spruce budworm and other stressors, we're losing a big part of those forests. And diverse forests are resilient forests, just like Sarah was saying earlier, and I'll touch more about that later on. But we want to be maintaining that diversity to keep our resilience in our forests. And then, of course, when we're losing white spruce and balsam fir on the landscape, this also has economic impacts, and it has impacts on our timber markets in the area, and the loss in merchantable timber. And so we're talking a lot about how spruce budworm is bad. We're really worried about the impacts of spruce budworm, but just like Sarah mentioned earlier, spruce budworm is a natural part of the landscape, and disturbance as a whole is a natural part of our forests. And so a big point that I want to drive home today is that disturbance, including spruce budworm, is just one part of the story of Minnesota's forests. And disturbance can come in many different forms, whether that's damage from really heavy, wet snow like we got a couple of years ago, other diseases and insects, fire, or even flooding from ecosystem engineers like beavers. These are all part of the very complex and long history of Minnesota's forests. Okay, so now I'm going to talk specifically about what some steps are that you can take as a woodland steward to manage your woodlands impacted by spruce budworm. The most important first step is to get connected with a local natural resource professional. They can help you make a plan for your woodland, and they can make a plan for your woodland depending on your own goals and objectives. What do you want your woodland to look like in the future? What steps do you want to take to help it mitigate the impacts from spruce budworm? And so when you're working with a natural resource professional, you're going to come up with a plan. And a really important part of that plan is thinking about how to maintain the health and resilience of your forest in the long term. And so when we're thinking about resiliency, again, that's focusing in on building diversity and allowing that forest to tolerate a wider range of conditions. Because climate change is bringing more disturbances, again, whether that's drought, spruce budworm, fire, changes in our frost regimes in the winter. So forests need to be able to tolerate a wider range of conditions. And to do that, we need to promote resiliency in our forests. And to do that, we can take several different methods to improve resiliency. One way is to harvest, to open up growing space. Growing space is the physical space and the resources that trees need to grow. And trees need to have enough growing space so that they can be vigorous and healthy, and they are accessing the resources that they need. So healthy trees are going to contribute to a more resilient forest. Also, promoting a mix of species in our forest creates resilient forests. So steering away from just having balsam fir and spruce, which again is going to be really susceptible to the impacts of spruce budworm, and incorporating more species of conifer, or maybe maples, oaks, whatever it may be, depending on your own goals for your woodland. So now let's think specifically about steps that we can take to manage spruce budworm. And you want to first start by asking yourself two questions. First, how much balsam fir do you have? And two, what are the conditions of your forest? How old is it? How dense are the trees? And how healthy and vigorous is it? And so by asking ourselves these questions, we can use forest management to help mitigate the impacts of spruce budworm and minimize our losses. So let's first consider a situation where our woodland is made primarily out of balsam fir. And maybe that stand is already infested with spruce budworm and already experiencing some rates of defoliation or mortality. We want to look at how are those trees doing already? Are they healthy or are they doing poorly? To evaluate how healthy and vigorous they are, we can look at the live crown ratio. And the live crown ratio is the size of the crown of the tree compared to the full height of the tree. A healthy, vigorous tree is going to have a larger crown. An unhealthy tree that's not doing so well is going to have a small, scraggly little crown. And so when you have a low live crown ratio, that indicates that those trees probably aren't doing as well and aren't as vigorous. So in this case, that forest is going to be really susceptible to severe impacts from budworm. And so in that case, a clear cut or another kind of harvest to try to get rid as much of that balsam fir and spruce would be the best. But unfortunately, we're kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place right now with some poor markets for balsam fir in the area due to changes in market structure in recent years. So in that case, the best option may be to cut and pile the balsam fir. And slash piles can have a lot of benefits for wildlife, including pollinators. And creating those types of structures can be something that you can work with your forester on to figure out the best option for you. Then our management for spruce dominant stands is going to be a little bit different than balsam fir stands, just because spruce isn't the #1 preferred host for spruce budworm. And so for spruce, you could consider either a pre-commercial or a commercial thinning. So thinking first about the age of the trees and how healthy they are, if you have younger, healthy spruce trees, you can thin those, especially if those spruce stands are growing in very dense conditions. And this is because those trees are likely to respond well to thinning and put on growth following the thin. However, if the spruce stand is older and maybe currently experiencing an outbreak, or it's older and has never been thinned in its lifetime, thinning would not be recommended in those scenarios. And that's because those spruce trees are unlikely to respond to thinning. So let's talk a little bit more about that, about when you shouldn't thin a spruce stand. So first, you want to avoid thinning spruce stands during excessive drought and during active outbreaks. And that's because those trees are already very stressed. And like I've already said, trees have a priority list of what they put their energy towards. So when those trees are stressed from drought or from the outbreak, they're already putting a lot of energy just towards fighting off that drought, fighting off the outbreak. So if we go in there and thin, they're not going to have excess energy to put towards growing, putting on vertical growth and horizontal growth. So that they're not going to have a response to the thinning. And this is what we call thinning shock, when they don't grow after the thinning in the way that we would expect them to. And then on the other hand, we wouldn't want to thin older trees that are in very dense stands that have never been thinned or are currently experiencing an outbreak. And this is because as trees age, their growth rates plateau. So as they get older, and if we go in there and thin, again, those older trees aren't going to have a lot of excess energy to put towards putting on extra growth, vertical or horizontal, because a lot of their energy is just going towards maintaining themselves, maybe putting on cones or just maintaining their basic functions, but they aren't growing as much anymore. So again, they're not going to respond to that thinning necessarily by putting on extra growth. So thinning wouldn't be recommended in that case. And so when we're talking about harvesting and maybe connecting with a logger, there are some things to know. And Sarah last year did some research and contacted the local mill headstrums to get some extra details about what type of conditions do you need to have to actually harvest a spruce stand specifically. And they told us that logging makes the most economic sense right now for when you have a stand that's at least 15 to 20 acres of spruce that's also relatively large and healthy. And that wood needs to be able to be cut into 16-foot lengths with 6-inch diameters. So there are some conditions there that need to be met. But again, like I mentioned earlier, harvesting and hauling that wood off your land isn't the only option. There are other options as well that you could work with your natural resource professional on, like creating wildlife piles, or other methods as well. So I've talked a lot about woodlands. Now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about yard trees.
So not everybody is dealing with, 15 to 20 acres. Some people might just have a smaller plot around their house or some, wooded areas that are much smaller to think about. So when we're talking about trees, we're going to call it yard trees, but a smaller number of trees, you have potentially the option to give more attention to each individual tree than you would if you were dealing with a large acreage. So some of the steps that you can take if you are able to with a smaller number of trees are similar idea of thinning, making sure you don't have too many trees too packed close together so that they're not able to grow and survive very well. You can also mulch your trees, which is a great practice to help them retain moisture. This little diagram shows you that you want to make your mulch look like a donut, not a volcano, because if it's packed up high on the trunk of the tree, that doesn't help it out at all. You can also water your trees, especially if we go into another drought kind of season this summer, like we have in the past. Watering your trees when they're not getting enough rain can help give them the best chance they have to be able to use as much of their energy as they can to grow and thrive, as opposed to being hit by the budworm and a drought and all of these factors all at the same time. You also want to make sure you're protecting the soil around your trees in your yard, trying to avoid any sort of compaction. You don't want to drive right next to them on top of their roots. You also don't want to be digging away soil from right near the trunks of trees either. And of course, avoiding herbicides right next to your trees, like lawn herbicides and that sort of thing. There's a lot of factors to consider when you're trying to decide how to proceed with a few trees in your yard. And some of the things you might want to think about: economics. How much would it cost to have that tree removed if it does in fact succumb to budworm feeding, if it dies? How much would it cost to treat it chemically if you're kind of weighing those different options economically? Ecologically, you might be thinking about, we're facing a changing climate. Is balsam fir the only tree you have in your yard? Might you want to consider perhaps planting some other species looking further to the future that might have a better chance of thriving and having more diversity in your yard? You could also think about the age of your trees and the health of the trees that are already in your yard when you're considering whether to put a lot of energy towards protecting a particular tree or maybe letting that one go and planting some other ones. Safety is also important. If that tree that you're seeing spruce budworm feeding on were to die, and if it were to fall, would it fall on your house or across your driveway, or is it off in the woods and it's not as big of a deal if it falls? Safety is an important thing to think about with your yard trees. And then of course there's your personal values and goals too. Perhaps there's a tree that you have a really special, meaningful, particular attachment to. You want to do anything you absolutely can to protect that tree from dying during this outbreak. Or maybe you have some other goals. Maybe you're trying to attract wildlife to your yard, or maybe you're trying to screen a view of your neighbors. And in thinking about starting from that point of what are your goals for your trees in your yard might lead you to different decisions that you might make as far as what you're doing to manage or protect or let go of various trees that you have. I've been getting a lot of questions about chemical treatment, and so we want to talk about that as well. So anytime you're considering using a pesticide or herbicide in your yard, it's important to remember that safety is a really key thing to think about, and to know that the label on that product is the law. So you are required to use that pesticide or herbicide in accordance with how the directions are written on the label, and you really do not want to deviate from that at all. For budworm, most sources that you'll read about suggest using a chemical called BTK, which you can see the full scientific name written out there. And BTK is a product that's made of a soil bacterium that's actually found naturally in soil, and it's been marketed as a product that can affect species in the Lepidoptera, so all kinds of butterflies and moths. And basically the way it works is that you spray this product on a plant, in this case a tree, and then the caterpillar has to ingest that product. So it's eating the needle that has the BTK on it, and it activates inside the digestive system of the insect, and it kills the insect. Some things to know about BTK, though, are that it degrades really quickly, which is one of the reasons that it's promoted as a relatively safe pesticide to use in the grand scheme of things. It only stays on the plant that you spray it on for a couple of days. And so if you are spraying it now, it's not going to do anything for you because the insects aren't out on the trees right now. So you have to think carefully about your timing. So that's what this product timing and coverage equation is up there. You got to think about using the right product that's going to affect the thing that you want it to affect, doing it at the right time, and then making sure you're covering the tree. Something to think about with spruce budworm is that those moths have laid those eggs across your whole entire tree. So if you go out there with a little squirt bottle and spray around the bottom where you can see it, it's not necessarily going to protect that tree because those caterpillars are all over your entire tree. There is one private company offering a spraying service in our community, and that's called North Shore Pest Management. And they are spraying from as few as 1 to up to 30 or 40 trees around people's homes and yards. So think about that as the scale. Any more than 30 or 40 trees that you might want to protect, it's just not going to make economic sense to consider spraying and having to repeat that process year after year after year. Since, as you know from the life cycle, the moths are going to fly around and relay the eggs again next year. So spraying one time isn't going to protect your tree for the duration of this outbreak. If you're considering going with North Shore Pest, one thing to know is that they're actually using a different chemical than BTK. They're using something called acetylprin, which works in a very similar way to what BTK does to the insect. But the difference is that this acetylprin product remains on the plant for a longer period of time, about a month instead of a couple of days. And the reason that they chose that is because they are treating so many different home and yard sites that they couldn't possibly treat them all in that 2 to 3 day window right when the budworm hatches. And so they had to, what they described to me is they had to pick a product that would last longer on the trees so that they could get to all the places that they are doing it. They do have the capacity to spray trees that are up to around 55 feet tall. And they said that if people are considering this, you can ballpark. So they're charging, there's some base cost to them coming out, but then there's also, they charge by the amount of product that they would use, which is directly, related to how many trees that you're treating. So on the low end, you're looking at around $150 up to more like $700 the more trees you're going to treat. And we're in about year 2 to 3 of this current outbreak, and we can expect it to last probably 5 to 7 years. So that gives you sort of a brain thought about how many years you might be looking at treating if you're considering doing that. A lot of people have asked me, could these products impact other insects that might be in my yard? And they could if they're in that Lepidoptera family, so think caterpillars of butterflies or moths. Those caterpillars would have to be on that tree that they're spraying, or the spray would have had to drift to another plant, and they have to be eating it. So if you think about what other caterpillars are out at that time in late May on your balsam for eating the needles, it's very unlikely that's going to be impacting a lot of other insects at that particular moment.
All right, I'll do the key. I think I'm doing the key takeaways. So just to quickly wrap up with the key takeaways from our part of the presentation. So again, spruce budworm is a native insect that's co-evolved with our forests here in Northeast Minnesota. Forest impacts include widespread defoliation, so the loss of leaves and then mortality in those trees. And then management is really going to depend on what are your goals and objectives for your woodland. How big is your woodland? How dense are the trees? And how much balsam fir versus spruce do you have? And then for yard trees, chemical treatment is just one option that's available for you that you can consider. And so now we just want to quickly highlight some local resources. So Cook County SWCD and Lake County SWCD are both resources that are available to you. And I think we have some folks here from Cook County SWCD that would like to quickly come up and give it a short plug. That's
Okay, great. Hi, I am Elena Hansel. I'm with Cook County Soil and Water Conservation District. I have also here Stephen Janessi and Max Tostenson. And they are also in the office and they would be the ones you would talk to. But we are here to help private landowners. That's our role for voluntary conservation. So Lake County has the same role conservation districts across the state do. So we're here to help you if somebody calls and says, hey, I'm concerned about the spruce budworm or forestry questions. We can come out and do a free technical site visit. And we can try to help you and we'll see what we can do. We're able to offer opportunities like a cost share program where we can provide 75%. Well, we can pay for certain practices and we would cover 25%, and that could be in kind, maybe doing some of the labor. Things that would be included might be tree clearings, possibly, maybe some revegetation for plants and different species, increasing that biodiversity that was spoken about earlier. So those are some opportunities. We also are able to tap into federal resources. It takes about a year to get into those resources. Well, it takes about a year even for us because we're a small district with a lot of land. But with the federal program, it's on a different schedule. But we also can offer those opportunities, which offers more funding and more programs that you could tap into. And so we could help walk you through that process. And Stephen and Max are both becoming versed and well able to connect with foresters and bring out resources that you might need. So feel free to contact our office. We do have probably about 12 or 13 landowners already right now that we're working through from last year. So you might take a month or 2 or 3 to get to you. Some people have waited a year now. We're just, again, we're small and this is one part of our work, but we're happy to help as much as we can. And so don't hesitate to call or ask questions and we'll see what we can do to help you. The same goes with Lake County SWCD. They have foresters. So those of you online, if you're in Lake County, feel free to reach out to them. We are able to work with their foresters and bring them up here. So again, we're able to tap into a lot of resources to assist landowners. Our number is right there. That's our main office number, and you feel free to check out the website. Thank you.
all right. And then here's Sarah and I's contact info. We also have business cards in the back if you want to grab one of those to take with you. So we're both available as a resource as well. And then with that, I'm going to stop sharing and Kyle is going to. So this, we talk about the contact info? Yeah, sorry.
Again, they'll be emailed out to everybody.
Yep. So we'll include everyone's contact information as well in follow-up email. All right. So now I'm going to pull up your slides, Kyle. Sorry, folks.
And we're holding questions, but maybe Sarah can answer this while you're working on that. Define the live crown ratio.
Oh yeah, so I was talking about that a little bit earlier. It's the ratio of how much of the tree is the living crown, the top part that you see versus the total height of the tree. So if there's more living crown to total height ratio, it's a healthier tree versus smaller crown to total height ratio.
Yeah, are there any numbers associated with that? Like what's an ideal ratio?
It's going to vary based off of the tree, but maybe about like 60% could be considered a really healthy vigorous crown for a spruce or for a tree.
Below 40% is kind of my rule of thumb when it gets stressed. Yeah. So, are you ready? All right. Well, thanks everyone. My name is Kyle Stover. I work for the Superior National Forest and the Tofty Ranger District, and there I'm a district silviculturalist. I also have a compatriot up here at the Gunflint Ranger Station, Myra Thymer. I'm actually here for her today. So part of what I do, I'm a silviculturist, but more broadly, I'm a forester. And how I am tied into spruce budworm and insect and disease is that part of my job is to monitor forest health events going on in the forest through our forest inventory, and then how do we plan on responding to those events as they happen? What are our timber tools available? What are our fuels and other fire treatments we might have available? And just as important, what's the future forest that we're going to be growing into the future after that disturbance event comes through? So I'm going to be building off. I absolutely love Sarah and Anna's presentation today. A lot of those recommendations are ones that we use on the Superior National Forest System lands. But I'll be focusing on what we've been doing primarily on the eastern half of the Superior, where we've seen the most growth in spruce budworm defoliation in the last recent years. So I'll just quick step back into our current setting here on the North Shore. 2023 was our largest defoliation event that we've seen since 1961. Like I said, this is a native disturbance event. Spruce budworm has been here for a long time. It comes through in 30 to 40 year cycles, and our forest plan actually uses forest ecology modeling that uses wind events, fire, and spruce budworm outbreaks as part of the modeling that feeds into our forest planning and our objectives that we set in our forest plan there. So, and this is just a picture from the air. This is just north of the Breton Peak trailhead along the Sawville Trail. This is a spruce plantation complex up there, and we'll get going into more of some of the conditions on the Superior, but we're seeing a large expansive growth in spruce budworm defoliation related to some of our spruce plantations. And I just want to zoom in a little bit, arguably somewhere around 2013 to 2016 is about when people most agree that this outbreak actually started. A little closer over on the Kawishiri Ranger District and Hoyt Lakes area. And over time, 2016 is when we first started picking it up in the Isabella area. And over time, this, we can see it's more of a blob that has moved around on our landscape and expanded and moved and shifted and going north and south all the way down to Two Harbors. 2018, more so in Isabella. 2019. 2020, there was no aerial detection flight that went on due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so this was a model product of approximate outbreak extent. But 2021 is where we had a large drought event going on. Most people remember we had a series of fires that were happening along the forest. But this is when it was first really starting to push into Cook County from the eastern Lake County line. And let's see if I can, does this have a pointer here?
It does. A little green line.
Oh, green line, thank you. Oh, let's see. So down in this area is the area of the Greenwood fire, down by the McDougall Lakes area in the Greenwood Lake area. And over here, there was the John Eck fire in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. So it was right about there. So just a bit of context of fire, drought, and insect and disease do go together. And then 2022, shifting further east, and then to our current extent where, Cook County is well involved right now, both in the boundary waters and outside, as well as most of Lake County, eastern Lake County. And I'll talk a little bit about our host species, just in the context of how it makes up our landscape on the Superior. Balsam fir, like I said again, is by far the more susceptible host species and has mortality sooner rather than white spruce with repeated defoliation. A couple of key points. Balsam fir can make up the majority of stand conditions out there, but also, and more often than not, actually makes up the developing mid-story and understory of older hardwood stands. It's shade tolerant, develops underneath the canopy, and something to be said too with spruce budworm is not the only insect and disease factor that goes with balsam fir. There's a lot of other insect diseases that impact balsam fir, and it doesn't get, for that reason, it doesn't get very old. A 40-year-old balsam fir tree is actually pretty old. And if anyone's built a campfire and thrown a live balsam fir branch on there, balsam fir does burn very well, both live and dead. So it is one of those tree species we're managing out there in the landscape, regardless of a budworm event for wildland fuels concerns. And there's more evidence that we have from, like Sarah said, or excuse me, Anna said, from past land management actions and the exclusion of fire in the last 100 years. We arguably have more of that on a landscape now than we might have had historically. And this is just the other condition you'll often see it in, is balsam fir making up that heavy mid-story of hardwood stands, aspen and birch. And this isn't necessarily an uncommon scenario, even in forest ecology. This is a natural stand dynamic. It can increase fire risk in the short term, but those trees die and make other growing space for white pine, even more white spruce, or northern white cedar. But arguably on landscape too, we're also dealing with less species diversity for seed sources of more white pine and cedar. So that's something we're concerned about as well from a forest resiliency standpoint. And the other end of the equation with white spruce, it can withstand more years of repeated defoliation. Black spruce is actually less acceptable because black spruce buds out later than white spruce, and that timing doesn't set up as well with budworms. So we do have white spruce plantations growing next to black spruce plantations, and you can actually see the black spruce plantations aren't nearly as impacted. But during the 1960s, the 70s, and 80s, there was a big push for managing white spruce plantations and red pine plantations. At that time, there was a lot of acres planted, not just on the Forest Service, but across the different land agencies. And the reason they did that is quite frankly, single species plantations are easier to manage. But what that does is it reduces stand diversity, and we learned a lot in those successive years. White spruce does not respond to thinning nearly as effectively as red pine. So now we have a situation where we have more white spruce plantations that are now coming about 50 years of age. Some have been thinned, some have not. And that's a lot of acres that are in a relatively narrow age class and have less species diversity. So white spruce is not a bad tree within itself, but it fares far better in forest mixes than it does in a single species scenario. So I'll segue into ways we've been responding to this on the Superior. The first way we've been reaching for the available markets and the timber tool is we prioritize clear cutting, especially now with spruce plantations that are ore heavy to balsam fir that are lacking species diversity. We're trying to prioritize those stand conditions right now while the trees are still marketable. And going with the slash and the non-merchantable material, we've been using the logging machinery to pile up that slash and then burn it on site after the fact. And the reason we do this is our options at the point when spruce budworm is actually in a stand, our option window becomes much less, and we shift to clear cuts, because thinning, if we thin at the time of a current outbreak, you're stressing the tree once from the thinning activity itself, because white spruce is relatively shallow rooted. It's already stressed with the budworm defoliation. You could actually end up with just as much mortality, if not more. So there's not a whole lot of options at this point, but we're trying to take those receipts from the sale of timber. We put them in a series of trust funds from that contract, and we try to keep that money right here on the Superior that goes into reforestation costs, field reduction, what have you. But just as important, what do we put back? A lot of these sites, they were not historically a monoculture of spruce, so we're actually trying to encourage aspen and paper birch natural regeneration. But increasing work we've been doing, not just us, but along in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, is going in and doing low density diversity planting. So we're planting white pine, even white spruce, and northern white cedar at low densities, and trying to grow both a hardwood component and a mixed conifer component, increase that species diversity, increase that resiliency for a future forest. And there's more of this than we have on the landscape that we can deal with before the as the outbreak continues. So there are areas that either it's unemergeable balsam fir or it's already dead. So we have been using logging equipment under contract and paying the logger under contract to cut and pile that dead material into these large machine-built piles. And we'd be coming back once the snow comes on the ground and burning to dispose those piles and then do some replanting or reforestation efforts after the fact. But ultimately, a set cost we have under contract with the operators. And another one that we have to do is understory field reduction projects. So these are actually hand crews of 9 to 12 folks that come in with chainsaws, brush saws, and they're targeting balsam fir and other species, susceptible species under 5 inches in diameter. This is labor intensive. It is costly, but it can go places where equipment can't go. It's more of a scalpel tool. And something to keep in mind, these areas need to be revisited, say every 10 years or so, because balsam fir will grow in after time. But some of this work we've already initiated prior to the outbreak. A lot of this, you can see a lot of this work along the Gunflint Trail. There's a couple active contracts going up there this week, actually. And we try to keep this to our high priority fuels and scenic areas. And another one I'll briefly mention, we'll have thinning operations of non-host species, and then we'll have balsam fir crushing between the trees. And we'll set it up for underburning with prescribed fire. So here we're reducing the understory surface fuel loading after the harvest operations, but what this also does, it's treating the balsam fir seed source and setting that further back so you get a longer time benefit on your treatment, as well as you're introducing the role of ecological fire back into this forest that depends on it. So I put together some numbers, how the Forest Service has been responding to the Spruce Budworm outbreak using those several treatments I mentioned. We have been ticking up and trying to prioritize our efforts and resources to respond to this. You can add that to be accomplished column probably to 2024 because 2024 is still early in the year. But we're seeing now we're starting here just north of 2,000 acres a year. This doesn't necessarily reflect a increase of logging or fuels treatments on the forest altogether, but it's a shifting of resources trying to capitalize what's happening right now with the current extent of the budworm outbreak. I will plug 2 projects going on the eastern half of the forest that are involving Spruce Budworm response. Here in the Gunflint Ranger District is the Blue Cascade Project. We had an open house about this last fall. We went on WTIP once, and we were trying to plug it once more on WTIP. But this is a project between the Deer River Lake area all the way to County Road 14. About 2,800 acres of treatments altogether, and its main objective is to restore especially these spruce plantations and heavy balsam fir stands that relate to a fuels issue as well as a restoration issues. I can certainly, this URL is the location where this project planning records are on our web. I'll have a plug for that, and this is the map associated with this. We're finalizing our last version of the map in response to some public comments right now, and we're looking to get a decision memo assigned with this project relatively soon. So I'll stick around after the presentation today and point folks in the right area if folks have more questions. On the Tofty District side, so roughly the Caribou Trail area west to Isabella, we have a project already called the Tofty Landscape Project, which involves all lands outside the boundary waters on the Tofty District. We had an estimated implementation plan. We had a rough idea of what treatments we wanted for 15 years, but it really focuses on, we have a 2-year implementation window where we have a narrower planning to implementation plan. So we will have an open house on the second cycle of Tofty Landscape Project coming up here in early summer, so stay tuned for that, where we actually have a map and invite more public comment. And but some of the themes that are popping up for that cycle are spruce budworm response, as well as moose habitat and other restoration issues we'll be working on. So stay tuned. And with that, I always like to point folks to our Superior National Forest webpage. If you search Google Superior National Forest planning projects, you'll get taken to our project planning webpage. It has links to the Blue Cascade Project, Tofty Landscape Project. Folks can sign up for our forest-wide mailing list if you so choose. But any other questions, by all means, I listed the Gunflint Ranger Station, the Tofty Ranger Stations. We can also always get you pointed in the right directions with any questions you have there. My information is included, as well as my compatriot Meyer Thimer up at the Gunflint Ranger Station. So with that, thank you. And like I said, I'll have some of those URL links that we'll send out with Kelsey and our contact information as well. But yeah, we'll be around after the fact too for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Switch the screen one last time, and hopefully I don't mess it up this time. Zoom this year. Perfect.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Beester. I'm the coordinator for the North Shore Forest Collaborative. And for those of you who have not heard of us, I'm going to go over some of the history of the collaborative and some of the opportunities available through the collaborative for landowners and connect you with some of our partners that we work with. The mission of the collaborative is to revitalize and maintain a healthy and functioning ecosystem along Minnesota's North Shore of Lake Superior, with emphasis on restoring and maintaining native trees and associated forest communities. Here are some of our partners. This is from 2015 when our plan was written, but we work with a lot of partners. The higher ed, extension, U.S. Forest Service, and Cook County are just a few of them. So I typically host partner meetings and we talk about updates, what projects people are working on, and then our landowners are also considered one of our partners. This is a boundary of the collaborative. We are stretching along Lake Superior from the northern border of Canada down to the southern portion of Lake County. And we're about 3 miles inland from the lake. So if you fall within that region, that's typically where our services are provided through the collaborative. Our partners typically extend their services much further beyond county level or state level with Forest Service, et cetera. Let's see. That's about it. It typically covers coastal forests, which are a little different from inland forests. They're influenced by Lake Superior, so they're going to have cooler summers and warmer winters, which impacts some of the species composition along the lake. Some of the goals are looking at those longer lived, which we call climax species. The forests are undergoing this progression of pioneer species and moving toward a climax species. So examples of those would be yellow birch, white pine, white spruce, white cedar. Those are the types of species that we are suggesting people plant. And those are species that have traditionally been left out after all of the logging occurred. It took a lot of the seed trees from those species. And what we see then after the deer came in, that highly go out, they like those species over aspen, spruce, or balsam fir. So we're looking at declines in all of those species over time. And we're also, one of our goals is to help our partners through those facilitated meetings. Some of them are looking at grants and we're trying to figure out how to best help them. And we also like to provide education on restoration and sharing education resources as well. So I'm just going to go over some of the accomplishments of our partners over the last, I think since 2015 is probably when it began being reported. 400,000 trees have been planted throughout the NSFC in particular. So that is excluding the work beyond the boundary of the NSFC. We've gotten over $6 million, not our agency, but our partners collectively have brought in over $6 million in grant support to help with reforestation efforts, with education, other types of
projects, and public land has been about 12,000 acres have been impacted within the collaborative again. We currently reach about 500 people in our mailing list, so we send out newsletters that provide opportunities like where you can get your trees, fencing, some of the things I'm going to be talking about. That's our main way of communicating with our members. And we also have a Facebook page, but that's fairly new, so we only have about 200 people that we reach that way. And I think our partners have put on 16 or probably much more workshops for educational purposes. So some of the programs we have for landowners, I'm going to focus on the fencing program, the woods walk advisory program, and educational materials. But we also do workshops like this one today. And we have a neighbor to neighbor program, which is basically asking everyone who's participated, if you want to talk to your neighbors, all of you can make an impact on the forests just with your property alone. But if you're able to work together with your neighbors, you can make a much bigger impact. It'll create wildlife corridors and other things. So our fencing program, as I said, after logging occurred, a lot of those seed trees were eliminated. So there were fewer species germinating, but then as the deer moved in, they ate almost everything. So we've found that fencing is the most effective, not the only method, but the most effective method along the shore to protect your trees. And since it's expensive, we wanted to find a program that could help people afford the cost. It doesn't include the entire cost. I think it covers about 40%. And this is through the Weeks Family Foundation. They provide that funding. So it significantly increases seedling survival. And we're focusing again on the coastal forest ecosystem. So we're asking that the species that are planted are probably more of the white spruce, white cedar, and white pine species, but also yellow birch and some of the longer lived species. And it's a good method if you are doing some of these practices with thinning your trees. You want to do underplantings. If you don't have seed trees that will have these species that we're talking about coming up, you're going to want to do some planting, and the best way to get survival is to use fencing. So through this fencing program, it's currently sold out for the spring, but we do it each year. Over the last 8 years, we've had good participation. It's very popular. We've had 465 participants. They can purchase anywhere from 1 roll to 10 rolls a year. And those 465 participants have purchased over 3,000 rolls of fencing. And if we say each roll of fencing can make maybe 5 tree cages, we're looking at over 17,000 trees that were protected. A lot of our participants are also planting trees and maybe doing bud capping or other methods that would keep deer away from them. So that's not including any of the additional species they might plant that were not protected with fencing. So here's just a distribution of where our fencing participants typically are. We have a good spread across the entire shore of people who really appreciate this program. The next program we have is new this year. It's covering the next 2 field seasons. It's free site visits for landowners. And this is something similar that Cook County already provides and Lake County already provides the soil and water conservation districts. They do a really good job of providing land stewardship plans for everyone, but that takes a lot of time. We're looking to visit 1,400 people, individual landowners that would take our woodland advisors out to a site, a plant community, and we'll ask questions about it. We're going to be collecting data on this, and we're hoping to identify some of the needs or lack of resources that landowners are experiencing that might be preventing them from doing some of the projects. So some of the questions we might ask or answer, we're looking at site specifications. If it's a dry site, really sunny, or you have a wet site or shady site, we're wondering what species would be suitable. So we're hoping to provide you with, based on your site specifications, what species would do well in that area. And then looking at your overall goals or objectives for the site. You might want to reestablish a certain community that you think was there, or there might be indications of what community had been there. So we'll help you try and piece that together. Today I've seen a lot of people taking photos of the slides for information on how to get in touch with people. We realize that all of our partners are doing really great work, and you have to know who to contact and where their information is available. So one of the goals that we're trying to accomplish is creating educational materials that cover some of those topics and pulling together the resources for how to contact those partners in one location. So hopefully you can go to our website in the future and have one place to find everything you're looking for. And we're also, another one of those is planting materials, where to get trees and other things. We try to advertise that, and I'm still learning of, I think I can't remember timber harvesting or the lumber mill up north. Headstrom's. I just realized that they give away free trees and I never knew that. And they've been doing it for a long time.
Yes.
So getting all that information out to everybody, it takes a lot of work. So some of the questions we'll ask is, what is unique about your property? Everyone appreciates it for a different reason. What are your hopes and goals for your property? We will identify the species present on your property if you don't already know that. If we see invasive species, we will let you know which ones there are. We're also putting together invasive species materials so that if you feel like you want to take that on yourself, you'll have the tools you need to figure out how to do that, or contacts who you could hire to do that for you. There are also early detection species of really ones that could do a lot of damage if they are found in this area. So we have lists of those, and if we see those, we will notify soil and water districts to let them know so that they're on the list of what to do. We'll tell you which habitat or forest ecosystem is present, and we'll tell you some of the ways of improving the ecosystem and meeting your goals. So then we'll provide recommendations, and this is much smaller than a land stewardship plan that SWCD might produce for you, but we'll give you a list of appropriate species to plant and suggested mitigation actions if we find invasive species, or you have spruce budworm, or emerald ash borer is not as much of a concern up here, but I'm guessing it will be in the upcoming years. We'll provide tree planting instruction and care, climate change considerations. And then we'll also give you lists of resources. So we're hoping to post all of these things online as well. Hopefully this week we'll have it available online. We don't currently, but we will also provide the lists themselves when we go visit your site. So we're looking at foresters. If you would like to get in touch with, the DNR has foresters available to you. Soil and water districts have resources available, invasive teams removal, and contractors that you might want to hire to do some of the work. So the educational materials that I've been talking about, I'm just going to go through the list. We're looking at land history. One of the resources is the early land surveys where they did bearing trees. It can be difficult to navigate the website, but it is very interesting if you want to know what your forest community was likely like. They looked for the largest tree near a point, and they wrote down what species it was and what size it was, so you have a good indication of what that forest might have looked like. We are looking at tree species guidance. So how to plant the tree, how to protect the tree, looking at plant communities, what was here, and what might be some of the indicators of what should be in your property. And then looking at climate change, what are some of the actions you could take in your forests, and recommended species based on those plant communities and climate change. We're also, as I said, looking at invasive species identification and treatment so that you can do some of the work on your own if you feel that you'd like to take that on. It can be very physical work, but some people really like doing it. We're also putting together a list of local resources, tree and shrub sales, local foresters and contractors, so you don't have to search for it yourselves. And then as we find workshops from our partners, we're hoping to be able to advertise that to larger groups of people as well. And then different land conservation options available to you. And that is our website there, northshoreforest.org. Some of these will be right on the main page. So if you're looking to do the Woodland Advisor Program, you go to the home page of the site. If you type it in, it'll directly go to that page, and there'll be a button that says Woodland Advisor Program. And there's another button for the fencing program, which again is sold out, but next year, that's where you can find it, is on that page. We also have a page for landowners specifically for other opportunities. All I have.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
So with that, we're gonna turn it over to questions. I'm gonna have Sarah come back up, and we'll just open it up for questions.
We'll have the large list here, so, yeah. So let's do first.
Hey, you mentioned Hedstrom's giveaway. We also have a seedling giveaway that I manage. And it's going to be with Hope, May 5th. All of the trees come from the state nursery, Minnesota, they're native. And this year is tamaracks, red oaks, plums, black cherry, and what else? Maples. So there's 5,000 seedlings that are going to be given away. So that's a plug. Then I have a question for you. And that is, you mentioned spraying, but what about putting those little pills in that address the budworms?
Then move over to the second.
Do you know any? I don't know anything about that, Sarah. Do you know?
I've not heard of that treatment being offered. yet.
Okay, well, I did it.
Oh.
And I'm wondering, was it a mistake? You know, it was with a local arborist in town, or maybe I shouldn't mention his name, but anyhow, he does this through a business, and some other people didn't want us to spray anyhow, you know, just in general, don't spray. And so we put in these kind of pills, and they had to go a certain distance in the circumference of the tree, and you had to tap them in, and it was quite elaborate. It cost about $100 a tree. And I'm wondering if it was really a good idea. I know that there are some trees down the trail, where is it? Two Harbors or something that has the big nursery. And they were showing us some trees that hadn't been treated and some trees that had been treated. And the ones that were treated were good, but you know, you're waiting 2 or 3 years to see is it any good. So I'm just wondering if any of you know about that. I can't think of the name of the chemical. It smelled like terribly.
I've not heard of that, so if you find out the name, we can certainly look up.
Yeah,
more
well, and
information.
I've got the name of the person too,
Sure.
who does it. So you might put it on.
Follow up later.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Carolyn, more question for you. When is the, we have the May 5th, but can you give me some more details? What time? Is everybody anywhere allowed to come get it? Is it just gonna be for those that live in Cook County?
It's primarily Cook County, but it's not really restricted, but you know, and it's all dependent upon the nursery, the state nursery, and you really don't know. I'm guessing the 5th, but it could be the 3rd to the 10th. You know, I've gone through this. I did the same thing when I was in Minnesota, and it's just a crapshoot about when they come. They're free, and last year we did it at the Bethlehem Lutheran Church. I think we'll just do that this year too because they help. It was supposed to start at 10. I got there at 9 o'clock, and by 9:30, people have helped me set up, and all the trees were gone. So
Could you tell me how people follow along with that to know what the date ends up being, a time?
yes, the radio station,
Okay.
WTIP is the main thing. I think there's no other, maybe Boreal too, but for sure the radio station.
Any other questions in the room? I know there's some online as well.
Let me give you one while people are thinking in here.
Okay.
Sorry, 1 second. We have, do affected stands benefit for intermingled planting of budworm tolerant species after the infestation has begun?
So I can talk about that. I mean, like, so it's not necessarily, I don't think, gonna directly benefit those balsam fir and spruce trees if they're already infested and if you go in there and plant other species. But it's gonna help that ecosystem as a whole tolerate those conditions and respond to the impact of the spruce budworm. So when that balsam fir inevitably dies, there's gonna be other trees hopefully in that stand that could still maintain that forest functioning.
Thank you.
The best time to plant a tree is yesterday.
Exactly. Good point. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about the collaborative with the plantings along the shore that's been happening. What kind of a maintenance program do you have there? I've noticed a lot, a certain percentage of those trees over winter, with their containers, those plastic cones, they're tipped over and stuff. Is there any kind of a follow other than just initial planting?
There is a follow-up. The cones are typically our Nature Conservancy partner. They're the ones who are using those, I think exclusively. I might be wrong about that, but a lot of private landowners are using fencing and state parks are using fencing, and Nature Conservancy is doing a good job of going back and maintaining those. And the fences have less maintenance to do because they're a lot sturdier. They do have trees falling on them and things that do need to be maintained, but I would say that's less frequent. And if there are trees that are dead inside of the fences, that might not be found for a while until someone goes through and checks them all. But otherwise, I think the Nature Conservancy is every couple of years at least going back and making sure that the trees are still alive within them and that everything's stood upright. But if you do notice anything in an area, you are welcome to contact either the state parks, they'd be able to get you in touch with someone, or you can contact me at the nsfcstaff@gmail.com. And I can figure out which partner is responsible for that and let them know.
I can add on the Forest Service side, we do a decent amount of gauge cage and planting ourselves, and somewhere between 3 and 5 years, we actually have it under contract with our tree planters to go back into these planted sites, evaluate the cages, repair cages, and replant that cage if that tree has died. Generally, 4 years or so.
Okay. And then how tall does the tree have to be before you consider starting to remove the fencing? Because it really restricts the growth size. Even if it's almost after a while.
Yeah, and especially for white pine, if you're not doing some pruning, sometimes that can be more susceptible to blister rust or other infestations. But I would say at least maybe 8-10 feet. But then one of the things we find, especially for white pine, until it starts getting the ridges on the bark, it's really susceptible to buck rust. So I usually leave it on a little longer if I can, but it's hard once it gets to be above the fence and out of the reach of deer. Then it's a good time to take it off as long as you don't have a buck around.
Next question here. How vulnerable are tamaracks to the SBW?
So I mean, Sarah, you said did you say?
I saw them in my yard last summer, but the tree's not dead yet. I don't know what
Yeah.
they're open.
I mean, it's definitely not a preferred host, but just like Sarah said at the beginning of the presentation, if there's enough pressure, if there's enough spruce budworm, it could potentially feed on tamarack. Do either of you have anything to add?
I've seen them feed on white pine as well if they're really heavy in an area,
Yeah.
tamarack. I'm not necessarily that worried about it compared to
Yeah.
white spruce or balsam fir though.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we get in this like spruce budworm fever, and everybody thinks every single tree that has a budworm on it is going to die for sure. And it's like you look around and there's trees that are older than 30 years in the woods and in our yard. So that means that some of these trees have withstood a prior spruce budworm outbreak, which, you know, there's lots of variables, but it's not a guarantee that just because there's some budworm on the tree, it will for sure die.
Yeah, it's not like emerald ash borer in that regard.
I heard that an arborist told me that tamaracks are sort of to be preferred now in terms of conifers because they don't really have their own pest that's dedicated to them. Is that true? Would you say that's true?
Well, there is eastern larch beetle that's more in like just south of International Falls in that area that the state DNR has been dealing a lot with it. It is an issue out there. That's another native bark beetle.
Okay, so they did have their.
But yeah, so it's like diversity. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is a good, I mean, and mix. I mean, I think there was probably more tamarack or eastern larch here historically than there are now, maybe. So
Yeah.
it's a good
And it's the
species.
same thing, larch and tamarack.
Yeah.
Tree.
Are smaller, younger trees affected differently than taller, older trees?
Well, yeah, so I mean, I think that they're probably fed on at the same rate, but like how they respond to the spruce budworm may be different. So if it's an older tree that maybe has been suppressed for many years, it may not be as healthy, so it may not be able to withstand the impacts from that defoliation for as long. In contrast, a younger tree may be able to withstand those impacts for longer. That makes sense.
And then do you recommend planting new balsams along with others for diversification and where there are older trees that have been affected?
Well, whether or not you should be planting balsam for, as with any question to a forest, or any answer to a forestry question, is it depends, but like it's gonna depend on what you want your forest to look like in the future, but if you're in an area with a lot of spruce budworm, may not be the best choice, you could consider some other conifers, like pines or northern white cedar, like Kelly was saying, but again, it's gonna depend, but just with spruce budworm, maybe not the best option.
Especially in the middle of the outbreak. If you're
Yeah.
planting new balsams, you're just like planting food.
Yeah, it could be just a waste of money and resources.
I would also add that they don't have a lot of problems propagating.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of shade trees around and they're shade tolerant. They'll probably come up on their own, but if it is one that's important to you in your yard, it's a favorite species, that's fine.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and another one for you. If you have scattered mature white pines surrounded by unhealthy dense stand of young balsams, would you recommend removing the balsams or leave them? I'd like to remove balsam, but instead of releasing the white spruce, it sounds like it might ultimately harm them.
Well, if there's a lot of dense balsam fir that eventually, if it dies, again, that could be a fire risk and could carry it up into the canopy. Kyle, do you have any specific recommendations?
Yeah, the fuels risk will go up, especially in the short term when it's losing yields and it's turning into surface fuels. Over time, it's more likely that a spruce would survive the outbreak than a balsam. So I guess recommendations. How much you have. I think it's in context to your neighbors and your landscape and then how much you have. But certainly when you cut and thin, you're increasing growing space for the other trees you have, and even a standing dead tree, is still casting shade too. So, like I said, I'll go with it depends.
Yeah.
But we're certainly doing that on the Forest Service side due to a fuels risk there, and trying to treat as much dead balsam in priority areas as we can. But it often depends in context.
Perfect. And then for paying attention to giveaways, will the North Shore Forest Collaborative be the place people should go to pay attention to general giveaways for Cook County, Lake County? Or is there one of you that you think has the best up-to-date information for giveaways?
Giveaways being free
Seedlings, yeah.
I try very hard to post it to our newsletter, which is the 500 people. So for anyone else who is not on that, which is a significant amount of the population, they would not know about that.
Yeah, you can always call the extension office too. We try to keep a good pulse on what's going on, at least here in Cook County, and can share information that way too. Yeah. Yeah, I did want to give one more announcement too, which is that Soil and Water Conservation and Extension and Sugarloaf Cove Nature Center are partnering up to offer a tree planting workshop to teach people about planting trees. And that's coming up on May 14th. Yes, on May 14th, and registration is open on the Sugarloaf website, and it's free to attend. It'll be in person at Sugarloaf. You'll get a lot of great information and a little bit of hands-on practice too with tree planting technique. So I will share the registration link for you to be able to send to everybody after this as well. Yeah.
Is there a way of telling when your tree is in danger of falling over? Because I have these enormous spruce next to my house, and I had to take a couple down because it so happened that somebody works for the Forest Service was there and said, "Oh, you have root lift."
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to get them cut down because he said they were going to fall over. But is there any other way to tell besides the lift of your roots that it's going to fall on your house or your neighbors?
Well, if it's very obviously dead, it's
Yeah.
completely brown, obviously that's not a sign, or if it's, the majority of it's dead. But, it's hard to tell, the inner part of the tree, the inner wood could be dead. Any of you have recommendations for what to look
I
like?
would say, when a tree dies, that wood starts to become brittle, and it's actually more difficult to directionally follow those trees and take those trees down. So it's better, the tree's still not dead, but partially alive, or take trees down is my thought with that. But yeah, contacting, a local arborist or tree care specialist would be a great resource too if you have questions, because it's not like a night and day thing. Is the tree alive one day and dead the next? It's like this gray period as well.
Well, we've also had those very high wind storms recently too, that a lot of living spruce with such a shallow root bed, because there's hardly any soil, just tipped over, and there was not necessarily root lift anywhere to be seen.
I remember another thing this person, this forester, said that if you suddenly get a lot of pine cones at the top, that can be a sign that it's about to. It's like a last gasp or something.
There's truth to that in several tree species. A stress cone crop response or seed response, when they start seeing, several different tree species can do that. So when it becomes stressed, or it takes resources away towards defense or shoots and root growth, and just puts it into something for the future. Yeah, I'm not sure if I would see so much of that in spruce and fir, but certainly, that certainly happens to on trees.
One more question here. What are the preferred alternative trees to consider for long-term diversity goals on, say, a 5-acre lot in Cook County?
It depends. I mean, like, there are many different recommendations out there for what to plant for climate adapted trees, but there are many different strategies that you could take for climate adaptation. And so really that's gonna depend on what you want your woodland to look like in the future. So what type of trees do you want to have? What type of habitat do you want to be promoting? So I would just, recommend working with a forester to sort through some of those details.
And then, do you all have newsletters? That everybody could sign up for.
Yeah, sure.
So we will send that out. So they all have
Yeah.
access to sign up.
Cool.
And
In a mixed stand with aspen and balsam, what's with the goal of fuel reduction as well as trying to stimulate the health durability of the aspen, what's the best way besides hand labor to go in and do the call it individual thinning or hand selection, reduction? And I'm thinking in terms of mechanical mulching, which gets rid of the slash piles and those, notwithstanding their value for snowshoe hares now and in turn lakes, but just keep it simple. I don't like to have piles of potential bonfires all over my forest. Have you used that in your project so far? How destructive is it to the?
Yeah, well, first off, you mentioned, lynx and hare habitat too, and that's another part of the equation too. I mean, this is an ecosystem, right? There's other benefits, and fur is not a bad tree in itself.
So is retention of soil, nutrients return to the soil instead of the atmosphere when you burn it, so.
Yep. So, the mulching, we do use that as a tool as well. Sometimes you can put that on a skid steer type of platform or a skidder type of platform, depending on the size of the site. The issue we run into with mulching, you turn everything into chips and you spread that in the woods. Sometimes there's so much biomass you can actually get a litter layer of chips, and that impedes other species, be it white pine to whatever, coming back. They can't fight through that chip layer. So that's just another thing to think about too, of how much biomass you have there. Whenever we try to do pile treatments, we are trying to burn those, because the piles themselves is a fuel risk as best we can. But yeah, there's a mixture of tools available when we look at a site. Yeah,
I've seen it where they used to do the piling, they use a rock rake. And I'm talking about an area east of Devil's Track
okay.
on the slope. That's heavy clay soils. I just don't, with the slopes, I don't envision loosening the soil out that much to wash away in case of rain, so. Have to protect that as well. Okay, maybe you've got some areas of that, I can go take a look at them someday, or.
Sure. You have a couple of mine.
Good season ahead of me to come up and pay a visit.
Okay.
Thank you.